Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a minute. Right. See people rolling in. We'll get started here in 30 seconds. All right. Time to kick things off. Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar. Today, we are going to discuss a very near and dear topic for myself, which is global expansion. Of course, we're going to be focused on compliance topics around that. So what types of pain points and solutions you're going to come up against as you internationalize your business. We're going to get started with just a quick introduction to the topic and the speakers. We're going to look into a little background about how Alibaba helps support businesses enter new markets as well as source from international ones. And then we're going to welcome our guest today, Hugo Pecula, to explore compliance automation solutions for international small businesses. Now, the main bit here is the last one, when we're going to look into some frequently asked questions that we have collated for today's sharing. And of course, we would welcome anyone from the audience to submit any other questions you would have for us through the chat. So let's start unpacking compliance items for SMBs. Super exciting, right?
Let's do it.
So just a little bit of background here. I'm Eric Cross. I lead the sales team for Alibaba.com in North America. Many of my customers who are selling products around the world would like to know things about compliance, especially long tail compliance, things like re-export compliance, and really just what kind of fuss they're going to need to deal with if they're serving customers in overseas markets. So for today's session, we're going to be joined by Hugo Pecula, who is the founder and CEO of True Identity, who's a seasoned expert in global trade. He's previously worked in global e-commerce logistics. I started a couple of businesses, most notably for today, True Identity, which is a tool that can help businesses with their compliance, largely automating and just streamlining the processes and the complications that can arise from sourcing and selling internationally. So welcome, Hugo.
Thank you, Eric. Great to be here. And as you can see on the screen, we've got some pretty cool things we're going to talk through. But also, really dive into strategies that will actually save time, money, and resources on growing as you grow internationally. So a lot to unpack.
Brilliant. Well, we're really delighted to have you as well as everyone in attendance today. And remember, if you have any question throughout, just throw it in the chat and we'll get to it when we get to the last segment for today's talk. So just to kick things off, excuse me, what is Alibaba and what is our vision for helping small businesses become international businesses? So if we just look back at the history of Alibaba Group, the very first business unit was Alibaba.com, founded 25 years ago, pretty much on day. And since then, we have developed all kinds of solutions within what we call our ecosystem that help businesses take advantage of different types of opportunities. Now, Alibaba.com has remained focused on the B2B opportunity for a very good reason, namely the size of the prize, and we'll get to that in a moment. So how we have developed from originally being a directory of OEM and white label suppliers, largely in Asia, to being a full suite global marketplace with transaction solutions, logistics support, and so on. Just a little status check. We are proud to say that we have over 40 million global active buyers. among over 150 million registered buyers. And you can see on the pie chart here, just a little distribution of business types by buyers. So you can see about 75% of our global buyer base is some form or another of reseller. Now, if you are importing products and then you are reselling them potentially to another international market, there's quite a lot that you're going to need to consider. So I'm very happy that that today we're going to look into some of those considerations. Now, why would you be so zeroed in on exporting product? As you can see, a lot of our top regions for buyers are spread around the world. There's the United States is, of course, the largest buyer base, followed by the UK, depending on the category, Canada, Australia, and Mexico. So if you want to get at just a high percent of the opportunities on a global marketplace like Alibaba.com, it's very good that you first dot your I's and cross your T's. And again, the size of the prize being the main reason we are laser focused on B2B. It trades for roughly 6 times that of D2C. But of course, it's also a little bit more complex. So the value chains and supply chains, and I haven't added all of the complexity I possibly could here, right? Especially when you factor in national borders and things like that. But Alibaba tries to offer solutions for any given node on any given global value chain. So bearing that in mind, I would just like to thank Hugo again for joining us today to talk about some of that detail in the compliance space.
Thanks, Eric. And if hopefully you can see my screen here now too, we should be able to dive straight in. So, thanks for that intro. Obviously, I'm Hugo Pakula. I am the CEO here at True Identity. True works with sellers of all shapes and sizes, whether that be, manufacturers, SMBs, who have already exported or not, but really help solve those challenges that are stopping you from growing internationally, right? That first time that you decide to sell to an international customer might be the last time if it doesn't go well. And so making sure that process goes really smoothly is really where our focus has been for the last several years, and now into automating those processes for both small and large enterprises. So since we're going to talk about the actual strategies that you can use for global trade, our lawyers asked us just to give a quick disclaimer, which is that, of course, we encourage independent research directly with regulators, but also to seek professional counsel as necessary. Now, you will be able to apply a lot of what we covered today. And basically, as Eric said, and as you can see here, right, the value that really exists is due to the fundamentally complex nature of supply chains. So the real value to be gained is in the complexity, right? That's where the money is earned. And that's made even more complicated as soon as you move across border, right? That can be as many as 6 different border crossings for your goods, your raw materials, or even your product inputs. And, while this is where the opportunity stands, that also means you have a lot of work to do to make sure you're prepared for this. So let's define the players in your supply chain. Of course, that means everything from production through the logistics and customs. But in our world, we talk about that as raw materials and manufacturing. Of course, that comes with its own requirements. We've also got distribution and logistics. That has potentially the biggest implications for your customer experience, and especially your on-time delivery percentage, your ability to pick and pack orders reliably. And the last phase of that supply chain is the point of sale, right? Where your brand exists, how the customer interfaces, whether that's with an e-commerce website or directly through a marketplace like Alibaba, as well as the customs experience and the final mile experience for your end buyer. Now, of course, the different stages of this require different amounts of compliance. We're going to dive into what that really means. But you also have to remember that, your different logistics partners have different liability and accountability to you as a customer of theirs. So, who your raw materials provider is will have big implications on where you can and can't import, because there may be different eligibility requirements, restrictions. Forced labor is something to be considerate of. And as you work your way down closer to the customer, the considerations change. But when we talk about compliance, right, we look at the entire landscape, who is actually responsible? Well, while it can be quite technical, the answer is fairly simple, that it is most common for the brand to be responsible for compliance, because you are most commonly the importer of record, but actually even people who are not the brand can be responsible for compliance. And that's really why we're here today, is to bring awareness to that as well, is that in the world of customs, it's not only the importer of record, but it can actually be the owner, the purchaser, or the licensed customs broker who can enter the goods through customs, who can be responsible for making declarations and filing those documents. And so anyone in that chain could potentially be the person to be responsible. But that means that you are liable. What are you liable for? You're liable for a whole bunch of things. That can be the classification of the goods, the valuation of the goods, documentation requirements like import and export licenses, paperwork such as permits, fees, taxes, duties, and even power of attorney declarations, and making sure that they're up to date. That can be just general compliance, like with the regulations, laws, and statutes of the country. That can be record keeping and how long you have to maintain those records for, as well as, of course, payments of fees, duties, and taxes that are associated with that import. So there really is a lot to talk about. We're going to now dive into like really specific ways you can get compliant, and then how to automate them, both for cost savings and, of course, just streamline the process. So if we dive into, when we dive in a little bit deeper, you know, it is the importers themselves that always ultimately bears the responsibility for compliance. Just very important. That's why the slide's here a second time. Really important to remember that you ultimately bear that responsibility. So even when you work with an expert, like a licensed customs broker or like an attorney or a specialist in country, you are ultimately responsible. There's no pointing fingers in customs. So let's look at one of the most important concepts in global trade is this HS code, is how do we classify what a good is? How do we explain to another country who maybe isn't familiar with our like an ethnic product or a product that only exists in other countries, what this product is we communicate that through a global standard. And this is the globally recognized way to classify virtually every item imaginable. So it's quite a complicated concept. And when we look a little bit closer, essentially it's a corresponding numbers broken up into incrementally more specific categories, into classifications. So if we look at we're going to look at an example product, and you can see here an example HS code. We're going to try and just briefly classify these coffee beans. You can see that it is a bag of coffee beans prepared in a retail package for sale to the consumer. And more specifically, it is a medium light roast. It is prepared for retail sale to the consumer. And it is, of course, certified organic, right? It also, you can see here, says that it weighs 1 pound. So when we dive into the HS code, we have the chapter level, which is 09, coffee. We can look a little bit deeper, which is the heading. When we go even deeper, we get to the subheading, which you can see is very specific, even says roasted. Now, this is the HS code, which is really the global code. But when we look even deeper, each country has its own HTS, or the Harmonized Tariff System. It's known by a lot of names you can see on the screen, but you do have to be familiar with the HTS code for the specific country that you plan to sell into. So if you have a new customer for a country you've never shipped to, you can't just assume that this code on the screen is the one. Since I've used it in the UK and in the US, I can also use it in Australia. No, that is not definitively true. So at the country level, they get even more specific based on their local requirements, local laws, protecting the economy, prioritizing different trade issues. And we can see it gets very, very specific. Say in the US, 0035 here even specifies that it would be weighing 2 kilograms or less in retail containers. It's very, very, very specific, as well as that's certified organic. It's very important as well. So this is our complete definition. We can see that for the US, that's the full code. But once we start looking international, we have a new customer in another country. Turns out that in Canada, even in its neighboring country, the code is different and the classification is very different. So how do you get an accurate HS code, and how do you stay on top of all of these changing requirements? Well, you can, of course, use online resources, right? But you have to be careful that you use a trusted resource, of course. You can ask the seller for the code, but what's really critical is to work with trusted suppliers who even have specific experience with the market that you are importing into, not just where you bring it from when you order from them, but also where you're going to sell it into, so that you can get accurate guidance. So finding a good supplier, it's really important that you use some kind of mechanism to find a trusted supplier. Alibaba is a great example, finding a vetted supplier. And of course, you can ask them questions before you buy. And this is the right time to be asking compliance, asking for compliance information. You can also consult a customs broker or customs attorney. And of course, when exporting, it's also very important that you look for the export information, because sometimes export and import HTS codes can be different too. There also is a new sort of thing which we're hearing quite a lot, which is, well, can I use AI to classify, right? AI is the expert at everything. Well, actually, it turns out that, it is possible, but you really need to be careful and verify the results. That's always our warning or message to people is simply using a tool like ChatGPT is certainly not good enough. But there are some specialized companies out there that have really specialized AI harmonization or allocation, HS code allocation, that have gotten really quite good at this. And so there are reliable mechanisms, but you have to be making sure that you're on top of these requirements. So, beyond this, well, can't I just get my HTS code and then I'm good to go? Actually, not really. An HTS code actually changes quite frequently. So if we look at the US, this was already a few months ago. They've revised the HTS in the US 4 times already this year. I actually believe they're up to 6 since I updated this slide. And last year there were 11 updates in the United States, which means unless you're a regulatory expert or you're a customs trade expert, you have to be monitoring this day in and day out for every single product in your entire catalog. Not only that, but for your raw inputs, if you're importing all of them to the US or into any other country. And Canada's already updated it once this year, and many countries update this multiple times a year. So monitoring for these, if it's a challenge, this is a great opportunity just to talk about automation, right? This is a perfect challenge for machines to be able to monitor many countries, to be able to apply that to your commodity. So our company, True Identity, that we import your product catalog. We're able to take in even in some cases, 30,000 commodities all at once and make sure that we're monitoring for updates. We're seeing changes as they come in, warning you only on the things that you need to be aware of. It's a great chance, a great piece of your compliance workflow that you can fully automate end to end. And this will mean, less effort from your team, but also saving money. You don't need to have an in-country expert for every country that you want to import into, which has kind of been the status quo for the last 10 or 15 years or longer. Beyond that, there are a lot of compliance requirements, which we're not going to dive into all of them, right? But beyond just the HS code, we've got the correct value and using this potentially the CIF value. There's no zero value in customs, something to be very aware of. Country of origin, free trade agreement applicability, free trade zones, bonded warehousing, all of these concepts. There's a lot to be aware of. But when we talk about automation specifically, we can dive into kind of this section of criteria. So when we talk about PGAs or partner government agencies, there are a lot of potential requirements depending on your commodity, depending on your type of business, depending on the customers you work with, depending on your supply chain. These considerations vary, but if any of potentially these logos look familiar, that's because some commodities, say anything that goes in or on the body, needs to go through a Food and Drug Administration in the US. That's the FDA. Overseas, there may be a different administrative body or agency that oversees this, but they partner with the customs agency to collect that information at import. So you may actually need to interact with many more agencies than just customs. You may need to, have accounts or register or licenses with different agencies in each country. And in the US, there's actually even more than those logos. There's all of these and actually even more that didn't fit on the slide. If you've ever seen these before, then it's probably likely that your True is a relevant solution to you, or that automation is ripe for you, is that you may have licenses, that require updating. And if you miss that, it can take years to get some of those licenses. So simply by missing an expiration date, you can fall off the wagon of your compliance, and that can quickly lead to implications. That can be penalties at the border. They could seize your goods. But also it's about, accountability, about traceability, preventing, really, really harmful issues from entering countries like slave labor and forced labor, fake weapons, pharmaceuticals, all of those. So this is really the work that compliance is doing. And again, of course, there's all of these different agencies, and that's just in the US. But nearly every country actually has an equivalent concept of these third-party requirements, and they're administered by a specialist agency. So, for example, in Canada, when you work with the Canada Border Services Agency, CBSA, you would deal with what's called the Other Government Departments, or OGDs. In the UK, you would interface with HMRC, His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and there you would deal with the competent authorities. So every country that your buyers might be in may have different requirements, may ask you for different documents, may require different licenses, and staying on top of these can be really difficult. So you can either hire an in-country specialist every time you add a new product or every time you grow into a new country, or you can automate that issue away. So beyond just PGAs, beyond just HTS codes, when we talk about licenses and certificates, I sort of talked about this a little bit already, but those licenses and certificates can be, registrations. That could be with the government. That can be an import license or an export license. That can be, or that could just be a third-party license or certificate, like a certified organic requirement for importing organic products into a different country. So all of these create unique challenges, right? Not only maintaining them actively, but knowing that you need to file it, right? And who to file it with and when to file it. For example, if you miss the window in the US, firstly, you only have 10 days, which means that time is always of the essence when you're importing, especially in the US, but also in other countries. But if every day that runs by, you're spending a lot of money. The storage fees are exorbitant, very, very high. And if you miss that 10-day cutoff to file all of the requirements, say you forgot that you had to have a certified organic document on hand, you're going to have to pay to store that good. And if it lasts longer than 10 days, say to get it, if you missed it, you'll need to pay for even more expensive storage in a third-party warehouse or re-export and then re-import those goods, which means you would have paid 3 times to import a single commodity for a single customer, a single order. It's very expensive, very, very quickly. So these are a lot of the compliance requirements you might have to come up against, and almost all of these can honestly be imported these days, right? By using a solution that's comprehensive, that understands your compliance, your products, that understands your supply chain, your vendors, and is able to take in all that information and give you the different requirements, you can really move the needle on not only compliance, but on scale, right? This allows you to grow into almost any country, to sell to any customer anywhere. And when you use a global marketplace like Alibaba, you can find those customers paired with automation for compliance. You can really sell to anyone, anywhere. And that's really why Eric and I are working together to talk about this today. Thanks for letting me share about all of these methods.
Of course, and we really do share that goal of removing those barriers to growth that small businesses, especially those who'd like to do some import and export work, face every day. So thanks so much for the quick sharing on compliance subjects, especially those details around HTS codes. I think that just that you need to stay on top of the updates in every single country, it's already a really good reason to look into some tools to just help you out with that.
Yeah, exactly. It's incredible that people even did this manually, to be honest.
Yeah. So now I'm really happy to jump into some of those FAQs we mentioned. So these are actually harmonized between FAQs that we frequently get from our customers, as well as the type that True get on a regular basis. So I'm really excited. I think this is going to get at most of the questions that we're going to have from the audience. But should we not have the exact detailed response you're looking for, feel free to follow up. We're very happy to elaborate. So jumping right in, we're going to start with the basics. So a little bit of a slow ball for you, Hugo. Why don't you tell us what is compliance automation and why is it becoming increasingly important for SMBs?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what is automation and why is it important? So of course, when we build a business, it really is just a bunch of people in a room. I think people forget that sometimes. But that, you only have so much time in the day, and there are things that are the most important to your business, like finding customers and filling orders. And things like legal and regulatory implications often don't make it a priority, often aren't the priority for a small or medium business. So, why is automation important is that if you don't prioritize this and you just move ahead and you start selling and you're excited, you get your first order from a new country, you really will have the problem quite quickly that customs will detect that you've got this issue, right? We have lots of case studies on someone typing something wrong, one character wrong, and get stuck at customs for days and days and days. You spend thousands of dollars, and that really impacts the bottom line. So why is automation important? Reducing human error is an obvious answer. But beyond that, it's the alternatives are very expensive. The risk of getting it wrong is huge. And so prioritizing a solution that scales and also that solves your today problem, right? That makes sure that you can sell to anyone whenever you get inbounds is super critical. So that's really why automation is important, and why we're talking about it today.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. And if anybody wants any more detail, feel very free to either book a call with Hugo or follow up here in the chat. Okay, so moving on, what would you say are the very first steps SMBs should take before selling into a new country? And when does compliance factor into the thought process there?
Yeah, great point. So, of course, it's a great question. So, of course, there's a lot of things to consider, right? If you've already got your first order, then finding those customers might not be the first thing. But let's go a step back. Let's say we decide that we've got this new product we're going to market with, and it's perfect for people in the UK. Maybe it's an umbrella because I know they need a lot of those. So I decide I'm going to open up to the UK. We're going to run some marketing. That might be your first consideration. But honestly, if you're going to start selling that product, you need to know that you legally can. Some countries don't allow, you can't sell alcohol in a lot of countries in the world. You can't sell, there's a lot of products you can't sell. So number one is make sure you can legally sell it. Number two is if you don't make it locally in that country, then you also need to make sure that you can import it, because that's a whole different challenge than selling it. So certainly making sure, number one, that your products meet the legal requirements to be sold there. Example is safety, like food and drug, cosmetics, equipment. Next would be potentially intellectual property, making sure that you're not infringing on somebody's local requirements or local benefits as part of an IP protection scheme. But also making sure that you have the necessary documents. So proof of manufacturing, country of origin, any evidence if you do transshipment, if your logistics requires that you go via a third country, you need to make sure you're declaring where it's coming from, especially the actual country of origin. So necessary documents for import, but also that the vendors you are buying from, right, looking at your sourcing is so critical. Your sourcing strategy and who you're buying from is one of the most important things. Working with vetted suppliers that can provide you the documentation that you need, whether that's to get over export restrictions, meaning they might not even be able to send the commodity to you or you to somebody else. But also sanctions are a critical thing to know about. They're changing every day. In fact, the restricted party screening process, which is a really critical part of this, is also something you need to be taking into account because they change daily, and that's very hard to stay on top of without automation.
Got it. So quite a lot of things to consider. So probably the upshot is you want to consider compliance if you're even considering selling a product overseas.
Yeah, no question.
Great. So you mentioned documentation, and so I got a little bit of a follow-up for you on that one. So what types of systems or effective methods do you see SMBs using to manage their documentation? And on top of that, should something go awry, papers get lost or they're simply wrong, what should they do to correct the issue?
Yeah, great question. And thanks for the follow-up. So really the question is about this documentation, is what do I do to make sure we're prepared, and what happens if something goes wrong? The obvious answer is that preparation is always important, right? Not being retroactive, making sure you're proactive in your stance, and really having lots of backup documentation. So definitely one of the best things you can do along the way is to build a relationship with the import enforcement agency. So an example would be CBP in the US, or I mentioned HMRC, or even in Canada, CBSA. You can build a one-on-one relationship with someone there, and they get to know you. They get to know your imports. They get to know your product, your commodity, and your compliance risk. And when they know you, the chance that something is going to go wrong is much lower. So especially if it's your first time, I think reaching out is one of the things people forget that they can even do, and is something that's a really good hack, if you will, giving away the secrets. And of course, I'm always happy to make introductions. So if anybody here has a specific challenge or commodity that might be difficult or they're unsure, definitely reach out. You can scan the QR code. I'm happy to take the time to talk to you about it. And if you lose documents or something goes wrong, they're always open to a discussion as long as you do it in advance. I think as long as you are prepared to have that discussion, you'll be fine.
Great, thanks a lot. And so you briefly just now touched on getting in touch with those agencies. Any useful tips around that?
Yeah, a lot of sure. A lot of them have there's two sides. There's often the corporate, I call it corporate, like the office management side of these agencies, which is sort of less relevant. Really, what you want to do is build a relationship with the actual location where you're importing. So if you're importing to the US and you want to go, you have certain types of products, you might consider one destination over another. You might consider the port of San Francisco over the port of New York. Or if you're doing e-commerce, New York is the biggest hub in the US for e-commerce imports and small value, low value imports. You might consider using that port for a low value import. So really learning the market that you import with, especially if you're a repeat importer, if you're doing this every day, every week, every month, or even once a year, honestly, you want to build a relationship and get to know that market. So automated tools can definitely help, right? TradeND obviously has this information built in, but if you're just a new importer and you want to get in touch, you can certainly look them up. Just make sure you know exactly where your shipments are going and speak to someone locally.
Brilliant. Well, thanks a lot for that. So import rules, would you say that they would generally be the same or similar country to country, or is it just all over the place?
I get this question a lot. So really it's our import rules the same between different countries. The overall answer is no. There are definitely similarities. The countries, even if they have a similar requirement, there's typically some kind of localized special detail. For example, requiring an in-country certification, like an in-country organic certification, or requiring that maybe there's a quota, right? So the two countries might both have quotas for how much of a certain commodity can be imported. But of course, the US doesn't share a quota with Australia or share a quota with South Africa. Of course not.
Right. Got it. Thanks for that. So shifting gears just a little on supplier and product compliance. How can SMBs effectively ensure that the supply that they are getting from a supplier is compliant? I know you touched on it briefly, but if you could just give us a couple practical points.
Yeah, for sure. A number one piece of advice I'll give you is to run restricted party screenings or denied party screenings, DPS, RPS. The reason for that is that those rules are changing literally daily depending on the market you operate in. And knowing that they are not a restricted party, which is often terrorist organizations, don't need to get into that. You don't want to be you don't want to be helping those kinds of businesses, but it creates significant risk, right? That can mean the loss of your goods. That can mean penalties, and that can also mean long tail effects that mean you may never be able to operate in that market again. So that's definitely the number one tip. Number two is to make sure you're buying from vetted suppliers. What does that mean? Someone has been through their factory, or someone has visibly checked their credentials. So they might have ISO certifications. And so when you're sourcing, if you're working with a sourcing agent, don't just trust that they say, we've been there. Ask for pieces of paper. The more of a paper trail you have, the better. That's my second thing, and maintaining all of that documentation in a system that you can easily extract it if someone asks you. If it gets stuck at the border for a WRO, withhold release order, you will need to show lots of paper. Honestly, like this, big stack of paper. And that's probably one of the only things that can help you in the case of a worst case scenario.
And just digging a little bit more on that one, let's say I'm a small business and I'm working with local importers and resellers. They might not want to share their original documents with me because that would disclose to me roughly their business model, right? So how do I get around that challenge? What should I ask for instead of that document if they don't want to be too forthcoming?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So a lot of this question speaks to, how do I look at beyond my first tier, right? I'm buying from somebody, but I don't know anything about what's going on behind the scenes. And of course, they don't want to share that information. It's proprietary. So, this is one of the biggest questions. I've heard this at small business roundtables with the government. We share hosting those events. Heard this at lots of different events, trade events. For small businesses, it's one of the biggest challenges because you're supposed to do all this work. How? How are you supposed to do this? The basic answer is you need to use some kind of tooling that is able to create separation of those answers. So we submit lots of questionnaires to your first tier provider, first tier supplier, that says, here, provide us with your underlying supply chain, but we will not share that with the buyer. Now, you might want that information. Unfortunately, we can't get that for you. But what you need is the underlying check mark that says you're good to go, that you've bought from someone trusted, that you've bought from someone experienced, and that you've bought from someone that can help you in the case of an issue. So certainly buying from a marketplace with vetted suppliers, Alibaba is another great example. But also using any kind of third-party verification to say that someone has checked these requirements, someone has looked at the facility, someone has investigated the underlying supply chain. That is your best case scenario.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that. And any tips on, say, directories people could go to do some of that vetting?
Alibaba.
Great. Well,
I say it only because I mean it. But there are a lot of sourcing partners out there. Of course you can work through that. But you really want to be looking for that check mark, right? Somebody who has vetted a supplier, and vetted can mean all sorts of things. But also when you look through some kind of directory, you really want to be looking at certifications. I mean, there's a lot of ISO certifications you should be looking for, but also experience with your commodity. That's my easy answer.
gotcha. Well, if you'll forgive just a real brief plug, you can actually filter suppliers by verified or unverified status on Alibaba.com. And if they have that verified status, that means that they have performed a site inspection by SGS or TUV, as well as you can filter by have previously supplied to the country that you are in, meaning that there's a very good chance that they've already produced all the paperwork for a previous customer, and you can simply ask for it in the inquiry process. Great. So shifting gears again, let's talk about some practical implications here. So how does compliance automation differ between industries, between countries, let's say between business types like wholesalers versus manufacturers? Could you shed some light on that?
Yeah. Fantastic question. How does compliance differ between not only industries but type of business? Certainly between industries, if we look at something like healthcare, you'll want to be making sure that you're registered, that you're licensed to do that, that the person you're buying from is licensed to trade in that commodity type. In fact, in that specific commodity, ideally they have experience having done it before. That's across all industries. If we switch over to, say, the financial side of compliance, of course, actual finance has its own rules, KYC, all of those. But when you're buying, you need to make sure they're not a restricted party. If they're a restricted party, you can actually go to prison for buying from them. So knowing that you have bought from someone that is checked is critical. And then moving outside of healthcare, say, to food and beverage, it's a huge sector, I know, in Alibaba, but also globally. Making sure that those goods don't expire during the course of the logistics operation is a huge consideration. Not having the correct licenses or certifications will potentially impact that. Even fruit is a great example. If you're importing fruit, that's a huge problem. But also then in machinery, that those goods have been, I want to say, certified again. It's just, that's what happens, right? All of this stuff, all of these commodities require certification. Definitely they vary. And then if we talk about the different stage of the supply chain, say manufacturing versus a seller, manufacturers are needing to be aware that their buyers are having to comply as the importer of record on the other end. So you can't just buy from someone just because they have it on hand. Knowing where they got it from is critical. So if you're the buyer, making sure that the seller has those requirements. If you're the seller, making sure you have that documentation on hand. That's some of the best thing that you can do to enable more sales. And then in reverse, the seller, as you look at different markets, you need to be considering, how are we going to clear this into that country, through which port? It really does get down to the dirty details very quickly. But when you look at compliance, if you have your paperwork in order, if you've been prepared and you use some kind of automation, you can have confidence that you'll be able to clear those goods even before they've left, right? Usually it's down to when is it leaving? When's the plane taking off? When does it arrive? But if you're prepared and you've put the work in, you can really feel confident that that's all going to go smoothly.
Great. Thanks for that. And so if you just put yourself in the shoes of an SMB owner today who's interested in getting started with some export. If we're considering how many tools do I need to affect automation in my compliance? Is there a balance between training my staff versus adding another tool, or where would you say the sweet spot is?
It's a really great question. How do you look at building a system? Right? That's almost what this comes down to, is you need to have a process, a clear workflow that says when we get a customer order in a new country, or when we grow, when we expand our product line, what are we doing? What's our SOP? So number one is create standard operating procedures. That is the best way to, remove humans. Anytime you remove humans from a problem, things get easier, I find. But when is automation, when does it matter? When does it not really matter so much? If you're only importing one thing one time, you can probably get away with it without automation. But as soon as you start to do repeatable processes, as soon as you start to get repeat orders, or as soon as you start to sell the same commodities into the same countries more than once or twice, you need to look at some kind of automation. That is the best answer I can give, without looking at it, of course, on a case-by-case basis. So happy to answer those questions separately if someone has a specific question.
Got it. Thanks so much. So let's say that a customer is slightly more sophisticated than the last example. Let's say they already have some systems, be it ERP or some order management tools. What's the most effective way for them to affect integration between the various tools they got?
Yeah. Look, there are a lot of systems out there. So there's no one size fits all answer for how do I make sure I'm all integrated. Your OMS, your order management system, like Shopify, BigCommerce, WooCommerce, WordPress, go on, or a custom built site, or even selling on a marketplace. There are literally infinite choices. So there's probably no one platform that integrates to all of them. But what really matters is that the data is portable, is that you can take it out of one system and put it into another, and they speak each other's language. Whether they're directly integrated, honestly, it's not the biggest requirement. I think people should maybe step away from that a little bit. Of course, that's the best case scenario, right? It's up to date all the time. It's tracking your changes. But if you can at least export information and then import it to another system, that's generally a good enough solution. But I do think that you should be looking at how can it integrate. And of course, there's a lot of these one-to-many solutions as well, to allow you to connect to many marketplaces or to connect to many tools. So I'd be looking into those as well.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So it's really a question of it depends, as in so much of B2B, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that in mind, let's speculate a little further, shall we? Could you tell us what you think are what's the future outlook in this space? So what kind of trends are going to become best practices? Where's this industry going?
Yeah, awesome question. Where are we headed? I'm going to quote a friend of mine, a supply chain expert, Rajiv Mohapatra, says that it has literally never been more important to know your supply chain strategy than it is today, right? To know who you're buying from, to know who your trading partners are, to know how you're going to get your goods from one side of the world to the other, to know where your customers are, to know the data behind the purchasing decisions. It has literally never been more important. Regulation is only getting more strict, not less. Data requirements are only getting more strict. Everything overall is getting more strict in global trade. And while, compliant sellers are really happy about that, that makes some people really unhappy. And if your business model is dependent on not being regulated, it's not a good idea to keep operating. Be my other thought. Being in a regulated industry, comes with its hurdles, but if you're smart and strategic, you can stay on top of it. So I think really the lesson is it's never been more important to be aware and self-aware of your strategy.
Yeah, and let's not forget that the tools that the regulators or the enforcers of these policies are using are also getting more sophisticated.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You're really playing mouse and come on, you know what I'm talking about. You're chasing. You're always chasing, right? They're moving forward at a fast pace. And if your tools aren't following pace, you'll be in trouble. So you really do need to make sure you've got tools, ideally that someone else is maintaining, who's their core business. Be a specialist in your business. Allow other people to be specialists in the other parts of your business.
All right. Well, thanks so much. That exhausts the questions that we have for you today. Should there be any other questions, of course, I'd just like to encourage everyone watching this live or the playback to get in touch with Hugo and True team to just get some feedback about your own specific case. All right. So with that, any last words for the audience before we wrap for today?
Firstly, thanks for joining. There really is a lot of complexity in the world. And to kind of reiterate Eric's point, I think that's where your opportunity is. So take advantage of complexity, but build systems that allow you to scale. That'll really create success in global expansion.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Hugo, for taking the time to fill us in on some of these important topics. Hope that we all avoid a headache or two in our businesses in the next 1 or 2 months or years.
That's right. Beautiful. Thanks, Eric.
Yep, and thanks everyone for joining today. And should you want any more information or feedback, just use the QRs here to get in touch. Have a brilliant Thursday.